Hi, everybody. It's Dean Cohen. Let me welcome you all back to another one of our conversations. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Samet. Dr. Samet is a professor of English at West Point. She's written a number of truly marvelous books, which we'll be talking about. There are two in particular I want to call to the attention of the SAIS audience. First is this. It is the Norton Anthology on Leadership, Essential Writings by Our Greatest Thinkers. It is unquestionably the best anthology of its kind that I've ever seen, including some wonderful stuff like from the Arabian Nights. And then another book, and this is just one of a whole bunch, the Annotated Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. And it's first, it's just a beautiful edition of Grant's memoirs, which are truly one of the great military memoirs, but the annotation is actually quite profound. I mean, it is another book as well. So, Elizabeth, welcome to SAIS.
Thank you so much, Elliot. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
It's great to have you back. So, why don't we do a little bit of kind of biographical conversation, then we'll talk about leadership and literature and all kinds of things. The way I usually like to do this is we talk half the time and then open it up for Q&A. So I'd ask those in the audience, if you've got questions that you'd like to ask, please put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them. That usually fills up. So you can begin getting in early and we'll turn to that. So Elizabeth, okay, first let me just ask you, how does a literature professor end up teaching at West Point?
I've been doing it so long now, I have to do the archaeology. I came to West Point right from graduate school, where I happened to be doing some work almost accidentally, really, on military memoir, actually on Grant. And I spent a lot of time in graduate school reading Grant's memoirs while I should have been writing my dissertation. And then it turned out to be those were actually the same part of the same project. And I was at first quite taken by Grant's ambivalence about West Point. He said that he spent all his time there reading novels, and he assures us not those of the trashy sort. And I was very intrigued, really, by his experience there and by the impact it clearly had on him. And then when an opportunity to teach there arose, it seemed particularly attractive, owing to Grant, and also owing, I should say, to my father, who was a World War II veteran, and from whom I used to badger him all the time for stories about his war and his army, which was, of course, a very different one, but there are interesting continuities.
So there you are. You come to West Point without a military background yourself, and you're teaching English literature. And here you have a bunch of cadets, and I've lectured at West Point. I know they're all very fit. They're very tired. They're very stressed. They're running around doing all kinds of stuff and standing at attention and doing their military curriculum, as well as, a myriad of other things. What's it like teaching them English literature?
Well, it's really been delightful. I think that they don't necessarily expect that that's how they'll be spending at least a part of their days. But of course, we offer a full undergraduate curriculum and a full range of undergraduate majors. And the literature classroom, I like to think, particularly for the first years, or the plebes as they're called, and I'm now once again directing their core course in literature. It's a place actually to slow down, to hone skills of deep attention and focus and concentration, skills I think they will need to solve the very complex problems they will face in their future military careers. And so thinking about cultivating certain habits of mind and of focusing on language at its most difficult, sometimes at its most evasive and elusive, I think that's a wonderful skill for them to have, and not only for its own sake, but also for their future careers.
Yeah, I completely agree. We were talking before the session about teaching Shakespeare, which I've been doing, and it's very much for the same reason. Our students are a bit older than those cadets, but they're also very practically minded, and they're heading out to go out and do the work of the world. And yet I really firmly believe that one of the ways you can help prepare people for that is deep reading of great books, whether it's Shakespeare or Thucydides or Clausewitz. So you've written actually a whole bunch of books. I want to mention some of the others. No Man's Land, Preparing for War and Peace in Post 9/11 America. Soldier's Heart, Reading Literature Through Peace and War at West Point. Willing Obedience, Citizen Soldiers and the Progress of Consent in America. And then you've got a couple of other book projects. Would you mind letting people know what they are?
Sure. I don't think I realized this at first, what chiefly interests me are mythologies of war, and the ways in which they shape real life conflict and the attitudes of real life soldiers. And so I'm particularly interested in finishing a project that'll come out next fall on the myths of World War II, what we like to think of as the good war, and a war that had a clarity in many ways that it has been lacking from, I think, every war. It's safe to say every war we've fought since. And so thinking about the ways in which myths of that war have shaped our understanding of ourselves, of our place in the world. And then the other project that I'm working on now is a biography of Alexander the Great, sort of thinking about the ways in which the historical Alexander, but also, and more important, the mythical Alexander has made his way into many different cultures, from romance to comic book to film, and thinking about the ways in which a culture's attitude toward Alexander reveals at a deeper level some fundamental attitudes toward war and the exercise of violence.
Yeah, I think, I know you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, the city Kandahar that's Alexander. And it's right. The reach of the myth of Alexander is really, it's an extraordinary cultural phenomenon, in part because it's not just a Western phenomenon, is it? It goes well beyond that.
Right. It's a global one that extends to countries where he never reached, but of course he did reach Afghanistan. And your mention of Kandahar puts me in mind of a story that a colleague of mine told me, that when he was stationed, when he was deployed to Afghanistan and was in the mountains, he would encounter villagers, and the villagers who had red hair like to claim that they are descendants of the Macedonians. So they would regale him with stories.
So, teaching at West Point, of course, you have a lot of military colleagues. There are a number of civilian faculty like you, but there are also military colleagues. Many of them have come back from the wars. Do they engage you about literature? Do you end up engaging them in ways?
Yes, I think one of the interesting things is that literature in general, and poetry in particular, is much more important to many of the cultures in which my former students and in which military officers find themselves. Afghanistan, one, Iraq, another, just to name recent ones, but also I think in the cultures of our allies. And so it is interesting to hear my colleagues come back and to think about ways in which their own interest in literature has changed, or the things that they sometimes wish they had known before they entered another culture where a particular work was of signal importance. This year with the plebes, we are reading Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, which is the great Persian epic of kings, which, like the story of Alexander, which makes its way into Shahnameh as well, that poem is of great importance to a variety of cultures in that region. And to think about the ways in which the legends that are recorded in that poem have an afterlife in the modern world. And so that's sort of one I think, in addition to those habits of mind that the study of literature helps to inculcate, I think just the idea of reading some of these works and of thinking about the ways in which they exert their influence in obvious and less obvious ways.
When I was teaching my introductory strategy course here, every class, halfway through, they're 2.5 hour sessions, I would give people a poem to read, and we'd discuss it. And you could tell that half the class thought the old man was nuts. But after a while, they began to see that, well, there are actually things that poetry has to teach us about how the world works. Have you ever thought of doing a war poetry anthology? I mean, there's some quite remarkable ones out there.
There are. I haven't actually thought about doing one of my own, but it would be interesting to do a one that crosses cultures as well as times. They tend to be limited to one language or one culture.
Yeah. Okay, so we've been talking a little bit about myth. Let's talk a little bit about Grant.
Sure.
Speaking of which, and that is, look, you talk about. I mean, I'm very fascinated to hear what you say about World War II. So there's also myth about Grant, and I would, if I could, and ask you to respond to this. So I think part of the myth of Grant is, okay, guy of tremendous determination. If he went out somewhere and he got lost, he'd never retrace his steps. He'd just keep on going forward until he found where he was going. Just dogged and persevering, but also a butcher. Somebody who, would let thousands of his wounded die at Cold Harbor rather than negotiate a truce with Robert E. Lee, which would imply that he had been defeated in some way. So not somebody that you would expect a literature professor to take a keen interest in. Is the myth wrong? Talk to me about that.
So Grant is a very interesting test case when it comes to myth and history. Grant is one of the casualties, I think, of what we refer to as the lost cause myth, the idea that was really cultivated in the South, but then sort of shared throughout the country. And one of the pieces of physical evidence we have of that, of course, is something that's been in the news so much lately, which is the ubiquity of Confederate memorialization, not just in the South, but throughout the country.
Even in West Point.
Yes. But the idea that the war was fought for states' rights exclusively, ignoring, of course, the chief right that was being fought for, which was, of course, that to own other human beings. The very romantic notion of a kind of chivalric South defeated by an industrial North. And then the reconciliation movement, which followed Reconstruction in the latter decade of the 19th century. Grant's funeral itself is a great example of this. He had both former Union and Confederate officers as his pallbearers.
Right.
And
I think, right?
Yes, who was his good friend from West Point days. Frederick Douglass, I think, had this right when he talked about, the peace between the whites. And there was an acquiescence there in the Great Compromise. And the civil rights of African Americans were sacrificed as a result. And Grant's administration, of course, had made considerable headway in achieving those civil rights through the constitutional amendments, through the breaking of the first Ku Klux Klan. But those were short-lived and ended with this idea of reconciliation, the end of Reconstruction. And so Grant's reputation declined. I mean, he was, and I think we forget this, Joan Waugh, the historian out at UCLA, has a fabulous book on Grant and myth. He was far more celebrated throughout the world even than Lincoln at the time. He did this world tour after his presidency, and he met with heads of state as far away as Japan. And he was a global celebrity. And then his reputation declined, as did that of Lincoln in some measure. And it was only with the work of the historians Lloyd Lewis and Bruce Catton in the 20th century, in the 50s, that his reputation began, I think, slowly to improve. And I think that there were many casualties of this lost cause mythology, but Grant really was one. He's enjoying, I think, a resurgence. I resist turning him into a flawless mythological figure, because I think that's not what we need right now. And so I freely admit and own many of his failures, and I try to do that in the book. But I think that the greatest example of his understanding, of his sensitivity, of his strategic reach is in the memoirs itself. And that's why I wanted to devote so much time and care to that edition.
So as a general's memoir, it has this reputation. People even say, actually, Mark Twain wrote it, which I believe is not true, but that it's, from simply from a literary point of view, extremely fine. Do you share that judgment?
Yes, it is an anomaly among the thousands of memoirs that emerged from the Civil War. It seemed as if every general wrote a memoir. Many other soldiers wrote memoirs. It was an unbelievable landscape for memoir writing in the latter half of the 19th century. And having steeped myself in many of those, I realized the degree to which these old soldiers were refighting their battles and refighting their war in print. And they were as ferocious with their comrades as they were with their enemies in terms of who got credit for what and where someone was at a particular battle. And Grant resisted for a long time, as did Sherman, who published his memoirs actually a decade before in 1875. Both of them resisted writing their memoirs. They didn't want to enter this fray. They wanted to remain aloof from it. Sherman finally surrendered because he said, I can't stand, I have to set the record straight. And so he contributed his book to the genre, which is a very different book from Grant's, also worth reading. And then Grant, who was forced actually by a combination of circumstances, one of which was bankruptcy. The other was a diagnosis of terminal cancer. And in order to rescue his finances and leave his family with something to live on, he made this arrangement with Twain and Twain's publishing firm to publish the memoirs, and they published it by subscription. And many of the salesmen were actually Union Army veterans who went out through the country and sold the book, and it made a great profit for his family, for his widow, Julia. And he finished reviewing proofs just a week or so before he died in the summer of 1885.
Yeah, and that's an inspiring story that he's dictating this even as he's about to die. Let's again, let me just remind people to put questions in the Q&A box. Let me move to the anthology, which, as I said, I've been looking at a lot of these kinds of anthologies, and I really do think this, I mean this very sincerely. I think this is the best of the bunch. It's got a quite extraordinary range of authors in it. So the first question is just, how do you go about selecting? I mean, let me just, to give people a sense of what we're talking about. We've got, and I'm just kind of going at random. We have The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. We have Robert Frost. We have Rachel Carson from Silent Spring. We have Herman Melville. We have Virginia Woolf. We have Joseph Roth. We have Borges. We have Horace Porter reporting on Ulysses S. Grant at work. We have Atul Gawande, Marcus Aurelius, Lao Tzu, Ovid, you name it, they're here. So how do you go about organizing that and picking who you want to put in it?
Well, my idea for this was to create a kind of narrative, in the sense that thinking about how leaders enter institutions. I think we sometimes think only of those dramatic moments of leadership where we see leadership in action. But as we know, leaders are many years in the making, behind the scenes, and I wanted to pull back that curtain. So I thought first of a leader's initiation into any organization. and the idea that that good leaders, effective leaders, have to know their organizations rather than simply leaping in and seizing the reins of power. So I wanted to sort of think about what I call studying the system, and that leaders might take a lot of time and think about the system in which they're plunged. They've either grown up in the system or they come from outside. Either way, they need to acquire a perspective on the culture they're managing and leading. And then I sort of thought about the ways in which a leader moves through different challenges, faces different problems in terms of thinking about emulating other leaders, which is a natural human trait, but the limits of emulation. To be a devoted model to one's hero is not necessarily to become fully formed as a new and independent leader. Thinking about changing course when that's necessary, thinking about negotiation, thinking about all of these other things. And then one of the, you ask how did I choose readings? It could have been an entire anthology on failure. That chapter was in a sense the hardest because there are more writings about failed leadership than there are about successful leadership. And so the idea there is, how do we learn from failure? Because it's going to happen one way or another at one moment. And how do we then move on from that? And I think actually that's one of Grant's great strengths, was learning from failure.
I mean, it's by the way, I should tell the audience here, you know this, but one of your great admirers and one of the great admirers of this book is General David Petraeus, who has spoken here actually a number of times on the issue of leadership, who's had tremendous successes and has had failures as well. But let me ask in some ways, what's the obvious question is, well, you're a literature professor. What do professors have to teach about leadership, for goodness sakes? So not an uncommon question for us professors to get,
Sure, right. Because we live in a culture that values experiential learning rather than book learning. Yeah. And that pendulum swings back and forth, but I think we are very hands-on, at a very hands-on moment. My argument here, the reason that I collected these pieces, is that I think that by sifting carefully through this tapestry of leadership, failed and successful, that one actually hones the skills that a leader needs. So that study is actually an essential part of this, and that leaders cannot be all action all the time, but that these moments of tranquility, these moments where we work through earlier models and see their shortcomings and their strengths, is actually a key part to leading. And also that while professors are perhaps not living that life of action, what they're doing is observing. And there can be a lot gleaned from that kind of perspective, sort of standing away from the fray, I suppose.
So I completely agree with that, and in fact, we've remodeled our flagship degree, and one of the new pieces of it is a required course on leadership and ethical decision making. And it's been interesting talking to colleagues about, well, why would you do that? How do you teach it? Who teaches it? I'm not sure that's something that very conventional professors, would completely accept. Let me. I'm going to turn in just a moment to some of the questions in the Q&A. You're an extraordinarily acute observer. How do you think you've learned the most about leadership?
I think by not imagining that I was learning about leadership, by just sort of by watching a culture. I had the good fortune when I went to West Point to be plunged into a culture that was like nothing I knew. And so I like to think of the anthropologist phrase of the participant observer, because I don't wear a uniform. So I always retain a kind of, there's a separateness, not that they're not welcoming and inclusive, but you're outside the formal hierarchy in that way, and outside the culture, even when you're inside. And so that's why I love teaching the plebes, because I tell them they still have perspective and that they need to figure out how to retain that perspective. while nevertheless embracing the culture of which they're a part. So I sort of think, I think it was just observing human behavior in exigent circumstances. I think military culture is often just an extreme version of normal everyday culture, in the sense that all cultures have hierarchies. They don't always wear them on their shoulders. All cultures have moments of emergency. They may not be life and death, but they may well be. And so sort of thinking about watching how military and culture intensified all the dynamics of civilian life in some really fascinating ways, that it was only sort of gradually that I think that I came to understand that I was also studying leadership, that it isn't sort of separate or some kind of rarefied skill that is outside of everyday life, but that it is really, when it is good, it runs throughout people's interactions all the time.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with one of our students here. He was then a colonel, and he ended up as a 3-star, saying, "Look, teaching is a form of leadership," which I believe is true. So I'm going to actually ask a question here. First question, I'm going to, it's none other than our own Adam Zubin. So just so you know, Elizabeth, Adam had a remarkably distinguished career in public service, including a brief stint as the acting Secretary of the Treasury. But before that, the person who was in charge of coordinating our financial sanctions operations. He's a Harvard-trained lawyer, and we've put the arm on him to put together our leadership course. So here's the question that he's going to put to you. Thank you so much for being with us and for your wonderful anthology. My experience has been that outside of the military arena, the study of leadership has not received the academic attention it deserves, especially leadership in the realm of public policy and statecraft as opposed to business management. Do you agree? And if so, why do you think that is?
I think it may in part go back to this discussion we had about action versus contemplation, that the kind of leadership we recognize has a sort of physical quality, that we can see it most clearly on the field of battle, let's say, where it also has a kind of romantic allure. But I think leadership is much more practical than that often, and less dramatic. One of the themes of the anthology is that we have become in love with crisis, but that really good leadership happens in times of comparative calm. And that the idea, I mean, no one gets medals for preventing crises, but in fact, that is the most valuable leadership we have. And so I think in those other realms that aren't always dominated by emergency. So I think that's what it is. It seems arguably less appealing, but when you actually dig into it, it's quite fascinating to see all the ways in which people make small decisions and how those decisions go unnoticed until suddenly their cumulative effect becomes apparent.
So, there's this vast business literature on leadership. And even when you set aside the trashy stuff, 7 management secrets of Attila the Hun, that kind of thing. It's a huge body of literature. And business school professors are kind of turning the crank and putting that stuff out in quantity. Do you have a general view of that literature?
I think that there's a desire there's a sort of impatience, there's a desire for a formulaic approach. And we see that in military culture sometimes, but we see it in business culture because the pace of life is so fast that people want things right away. And so my anthology was actually designed, as my classes are, actually to slow things down, a kind of countercultural approach, actually, because I think in the long run, that's of great value. And so I meant this actually to be a kind of complement to a more formulaic approach. The other thing that I think is at stake here is the specialization and the compartmentalization of academic studies. So the idea, for example, you suggested resistance to this idea of a leadership course because it requires perhaps people to think across disciplines. And while multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity have become buzzwords, I'm not sure that everybody is extremely enthusiastic about undertaking that and what it might mean. But I think those really valuable moments when texts and ideas are approached from a variety of perspectives, and you find these really surprising moments of correspondence.
Yeah, but it means you've got to be willing to be a little bit adventurous.
Yes, yes.
We don't always value that. Kristen Blanchfield, who do you see as the most promising contemporary emerging leaders?
I don't know that I have particular people in mind, but what I'm fascinated by is the question of the grassroots organization and the question of the ways in which social media and the ways in which technology have changed our interactions. I'm not sure that I'm a little skeptical in some ways, and I don't do social media, but I mean, I'm sort of fascinated by, we talked about the Arab Spring when that occurred and the role of technology, and people were very enthusiastic, and then people backtracked from that and said, well, it was short-lived. And so I'm really interested long-term, what will be the ways in which we influence, because everybody is now an influencer. And I think that in many ways that actually creates a lot of change, but will that be long-lasting change? And how will young leaders who are so adept at managing various virtual platforms, what will be the nature of their influence in the long term? So I'm really sort of interested by people who work in that space.
So let me see if I can take this in a somewhat different direction. I've had an idea which I would like to bounce off you, which is that the basics of leadership are actually very easy to teach. But the problem is that after that point, context matters enormously. What kind of organization, what kind of culture. And when I say the basics are easy to teach, I'm sure this series of books you've read, the C.S. Lewis Narnia books, there's a moment in one of them, I think it's A Horse and His Boy, where this young prince is being taught by his father, what is it to lead? To be the first in every desperate attack and the last in every desperate retreat, and to laugh louder over a scanty meal than any man in your land. Okay, that's a book that's accessible to an 11-year-old. And there's some very basic truths there about leadership. But I guess I have often thought, and I really would like to know whether you agree with this or you disagree, that beyond that, context matters. I'll give just one example. I remember one of our benefactors, Phil Merrill, rest his soul, owned a number of newspapers. And he said, I would never put an editor of a large newspaper in charge of a small newspaper, or vice versa. So they're just too different and require, qualities that are different. So do something with that.
Well, timing is everything in a sense. I mean, Machiavelli was onto this among others, but a leader has to sort of be at the right place at the right time, but some leaders are chameleons and they're able to change their approach to suit the times or to suit the new challenge. I'll go, that Grant is one of my favorite examples, but two episodes in his career actually, I think, reveal this. I mean, so after Fort Donelson, an early and pivotal battle in the Western theater, which is much less studied than the Eastern theater, Grant meets up with Simon Bolivar Buckner, his old West Point friend, and Buckner says, "What are your terms?" And Grant says, "There are no terms here. It's an unconditional surrender." And Buckner's very upset because this isn't the sort of model that has been asserted in Civil War conduct so far. And he says, he has no choice, but he registers his unhappiness at Grant's unchivalrous and ungenerous terms. And Grant becomes a hero, and his nickname is now Unconditional Surrender, and that's his MO, until it's not, until Vicksburg, where he does give terms, because times have changed. And so this idea that that one persists with the same thing that worked. It's what I tell new teachers as well, that the same thing never works twice, that you come out of a classroom where you've used a certain approach and you're flying high and everything was great and everyone was talking, and then you try it again and no one says a word. And you realize, all right, I can persist in this because I know it's good, or I can say it is good, but it's not working anymore. And so I have to do something else.
Ouch, I've been that guy. Yeah. That's so true. So actually another question from a faculty member, one who you may know, Paula Thornhill, who both actually has one foot in the academic world, and of course she's teaching here, another foot in the military world, having served as a brigadier general in the Air Force, and I believe in the first class at the Air Force Academy that had women in it. And her question to you is West Point's leadership approach keeping abreast of teaching in this influencer world that you mentioned?
I think like every other institution, academic institution, but also other kinds of institutions and organizations, West Point's having to learn how its students are shaped by culture, by social media, how interactions are different, certainly in the classroom. That's been complicated, of course, during the pandemic by this kind of platform and everything else, sort of thinking about how we interact with people. And I think it's actually in some ways accelerated our understanding of what it means to interact virtually rather than in person. And so I think, yes, it's sort of each new class brings with it certain expectations. And I think that the institution adapts and navigates that terrain. And some of the things, of course, are very positive, and some are very negative in terms of social media and how it shapes us and how it shapes our interactions.
Question from Marjan Asasi, who would like to hear your thoughts on the limits that academic institutions sometimes place on professors' ability to express their thoughts. There's a particular reference here to Cornel West leaving Harvard. I think that's a broader discussion that opens up, I think, a broader discussion about views of free speech on campuses, among faculties. I mean, just the very fact we've been talking about the Civil War and the Lost Cause, and which leads, of course, to discussions about denaming and slavery and so on. So,
right.
Do you have a way of thinking about all this?
Yeah, I guess I have a personal way and then a sort of larger sense. I mean, I've been very fortunate. And I think that, and sometimes I think this surprises people who look in at West Point and don't understand its culture. Academic freedom is jealously guarded. And it's a wonderful, it's a hybrid institution. It is a military institution and an academic institution. And that is a very difficult terrain to navigate. But I think the institution actually does it quite well, and recognizes that the classroom is a different space from the battlefield. And one of the great challenges for our students is to be able to think about what parts of how to turn that off, right? On and off. What parts of their day are academic and what parts are not. And so it's a wonderful place in which to teach because of that, because it's in the forefront of our minds all the time. I think the preservation of the academic freedom and the preservation of free speech in higher education and beyond is, of course, of paramount importance. And I think doing everything we can to keep that space, to preserve it, is vital. It's part of our work.
Yeah. I taught for 3 years at the Naval War College, and I had a very similar experience that, and I would even go further to say the students, would be spirited in their arguments, but you didn't have a feeling that they would simply shut down if they were hearing an argument that they didn't like or try to block it out. There was no sort of hypersensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
And there was actually a kind of a desire for robust debate, including people saying things that they really didn't like hearing. And it was actually, I had a similar sort of experience trying to explain to people that actually, in some ways, a freer environment than many universities I could name. Brian Anderson. Dr. Samet, what book of fiction has most surprised you in its lessons for leadership?
It would be impossible to narrow it to one book. And my answer today might be different from my answer tomorrow. I think one of the works that I teach a lot, and that is perhaps a strange choice, I didn't include it in the anthology because there just wasn't room, is actually Hamlet. And I say that because it's about someone who's very uncomfortable with the particular role he's been asked to play. He's a prince. He is presumably going to be a king at some point. He also finds out that he needs to be a revenger, avenging the death of his father. And it's not something that he is entirely interested in doing. Feels compelled by a lot of social, cultural, historical pressures to play that role. And I love to read it with cadets because it's the story of a young person awakening to Hamlet's word would not be professional, but public. Our word might be professional responsibilities. And how do you navigate your own inclinations and the desires of all those around you to do certain things? Yeah. And that's the place they are as young leaders who have committed to this culture and who have, like everyone else, parents and friends and family members and towns that are very proud of them and that have particular ideas about what their future will look like.
It's so interesting you say that, because in common, I think in appropriate usage, you say Hamlet and what it conjures up is indecision.
Right.
So-and-so is behaving like Hamlet, when I think the deeper truth there is of course, much more profound. Actually, let me just ask a sort of a quick follow-on to that. Do you think their memoirs are one form of literature that have a lot to teach us about leadership, biography, history. I would even say there's certain works like, I don't know, Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive, I think have a lot to teach. Mm-hmm. What is unique that fiction brings to the study of leadership?
I think because it does its work by indirection. I mean, I never teach in class. I never teach a book as this book will have a lot to tell you about leadership. Because I know if someone told me that, I would shut down immediately. I would just say, here's a book and we're going to figure out what it has to tell us. And then what people get by way of that book, incidentally, or sometimes explicitly, what they bring to it. I want my students to be able to find those things rather than for me to prescribe certain texts or certain tenets or certain ideas. I think that's the great value of literature, to be able to tease those ideas out.
Unfortunately, we're coming close to the end. I try to break a little bit before the hour, which I find in times of Zoom is really the only charitable thing to do. But although I'd be happy to go on a lot longer. So I think this, let me ask, let me put the question to you. It's from Urvaksh Patel. Can Professor Samet say something about what leadership qualities may have made organizations like NASA so successful in the 1960s when comparing it to today's organizational cultures, where we have more technologies and tools, yet find it hard to galvanize the right leadership within organizations to meet ambitious goals, such as climate change, for example? In this way, what may have been some of the changes in leadership and culture over the past 50 years?
Well, perhaps with reference to the specific example of NASA, does that maybe have to do with the idea of young organizations as opposed to more mature organizations, when organizations are still figuring things out, when they're not self-conscious about their processes? Sometimes there's a kind of freedom there, and innovation. So I think that may be part of it. Once organizations become heavily bureaucratic and sort of have explicit standards to which they are always calibrating, then sometimes maybe they lose that kind of flexibility. I think maybe there's this dangerous balance. I mentioned this question of specialization before. I think the idea that, it's funny, we have two contrasting things. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, Elliot, but we have increasing specialization, but then we have increasing distrust of expertise. And so we're in this weird place where everybody does this one very specialized thing and no one really seems to trust, in the larger culture, nobody really seems to trust expertise. Yeah. But instead we value a kind of gut instinctive approach to things. So we're in a very strange place.
Yeah, I agree. I would add to that. I would agree with that. I would add to that. I think we unfortunately have a culture that's, I believe, increasingly afraid to fail, or afraid to be wrong in some way. Mm-hmm. And, you know, something, I reread another great memoir by another great soldier, A Defeat into Victory by William Slim, which is actually, together with Grant's memoirs, those are my two favorite military memoirs. And what's striking about that is the humility with which he says, I screwed this up on a number of occasions. Slim, for the benefit of the audience, was the British commander who led the British Army out of Burma in 1942 when they really got very badly beaten by the Japanese, and then rebuilt that army and led it back in 44, 45. Truly a great leader. But what is, I mean, and it's beautifully written. It's also, it's extremely lucid. It's a very, very compelling memoir. And what's striking to me is that he clearly doesn't feel crushed by having to say, oh, I guess screwed that one up. We got to do something different. And I think in today's environment, it's just a lot harder to accept that. And partly because you'll be beaten up by the external environment, but I also wonder if people accept more fragility for themselves than they used to. And are just reluctant to admit the possibility that they screwed up. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, no, I think there's much less room for that. In part, it's because I think everybody knows your failure right away.
Yeah, and they can talk about it on Twitter.
Right.
So I'm afraid I'm going to bring this to an end. I would have dearly loved to keep this going forever. Let me I'll ask one last question, taking the privilege of the chair. If there's one novel or memoir that people who are interested in becoming leaders, so let's think about our students here who, as I said, want to go out and do the work of the world. Some of them may be in the middle of their career, some of them may just be beginning it. So if there's a novel or a memoir which you think it might not have occurred to them to read, but you really think they ought to, what would it be?
One of the memoirs that had a huge impact on me was Katharine Graham's personal history.
Really?
Yeah, and I thought it was fascinating. This was not only, but a large part of it is that she is a woman working in what was emphatically a man's world, and she was resented and mistrusted for that alone. And then her own, I mean, she's someone who admits to failure throughout that book, and also this just fascinating way in which she learned the culture, learned how to operate within it, navigated unbelievable crises. And it's just, to me, a fascinating odyssey of someone who didn't necessarily imagine this for herself at the start, and then inhabited it in a really extraordinary way.
All right, I am going to go out and get that on my Kindle as soon as this comes to an end. Elizabeth, I can't thank you enough for this. This has been just a delightful conversation.
Thank you.
I said to you earlier, I intend to plot and scheme and try to find a way to get you here for a year so that our students can learn from you. I envy your students at West Point, and just thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Elliot. It's been a pleasure.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.